Yes, I have been taking German.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's very nice the way it's taught here because it's like an immersive course.
Yeah.
Well, like I was used to lectures in my language, in Italian, or for example, English is a foreign language.
Yeah.
So I really loved how languages are taught here.
Who's your German teacher?
Mr. Duclos. Yeah, probably you're familiar with Franz Beck, right?
Actually, no. No, so, no.
They have two.
Yeah.
You should sit there too, so they're
Every year
looking
when
at
we
us.
see he's retiring, we say,
seats.
oh,
You
you
should
know.
have the blue
A
seats
lot
too.
of people that were young folks when we came, and now.
You can sit there probably, just
Question about languages here. Like I have heard that until some years ago, Italian was offered.
Yes, it
as
was
language.
offered, yeah.
And how come they stopped offering it?
I don't know. Well, while we were here, it was interesting because Russian was, I think it started in like 1962 when there was all the Cold War things started, and so there was a great interest in it, and then it sort of waned, and then it came back, and it was a really strong department for a number of years, and then in the last, I think, 5 or 6 years, it's gone. I guess it's where interests lie. And while we were here, Japanese became a language which wasn't offered when we first came. And what else? Chinese was really just compared to French and German and Italian. And I think the classics were the classical languages. They still offered Greek and Latin when we came, and of course that was, for many independent schools, that was sort of the standard. And Andover, even then, in the 80s, was unusual that they offered Greek because most schools were cutting that out. It wasn't spoken Greek. I mean, it was classical. But they did, but Latin was still a fight. But one of the teachers who taught Latin also taught Vespucci.
Italian.
He was the Italian teacher, and his personality and I think was really part of the reason that everybody loved it. He was really well liked, and he inspired. I think so much of it, was the teacher's own passion, and he was really good. But I think then you could only take 2 years, and I think it was,
Of language.
and it was often juniors and seniors, or uppers and seniors were. That's what I recall. That sounds right. But Vinny Pescucci, we called him the Italian stallion. The kids did. We didn't. But I heard that. Just.
So what are you trying? Are you going to produce a film or a written report, or what would you like to do?
Yeah, probably a little bit of everything. So maybe a booklet for the campus, for the students and the faculty members, and then definitely a footage or something like a documentary.
There are so many stories that we know snippets already, but I've been passionate about capturing stories, anecdotes, but also lived experiences. And I just connected with a German former Kemper scholar. He was here in 82. He graduated the same year here when I graduated in Germany from school. He had not come back to Andover, and he was so excited to be here and reconnected today. But we also know that it is an American high school with a public purpose, and it was back then, and there was always the emphasis, but all of us are international. I'm now dual citizen of Germany and the United States, but my role is being the international student coordinator here and helping them the transition and beyond. But we want to make sure also that we capture those stories and learn from people like you. How was it back then? What do you remember about international students? Do you remember Kemper scholars? What were your roles to support them?
And how many Kemper scholars are there now?
4.
4 students?
Every year.
4 year, every year?
Yeah.
You may want to share what we learned, because during
Yeah.
their time, it probably was different.
Exactly. Maybe in your years there were more students of
Okay.
campus scholars.
Slightly more, yes, yeah.
Like we have the list of all campus scholars, and we know that some years there were even 12, and some
I was
were
gonna
coming,
say 6 to 8, but yes.
or
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and some were even coming from Canada or Asia.
And Jamaica, we found one from Jamaica,
Yeah.
because for a while they were all lumped in as being just 1 year seniors or PGs, postgraduates
Yeah.
here. And so that was new, because I was under the impression they were always Europeans, because John Kemper was really interested. You may remember he's went to Europe several times, and thanks to him we had the schoolboys abroad, which then became
School
SYA.
years. Yeah.
And he was very interested in learning from other educational systems, and particularly the European system.
Yeah.
And yet it was inclusive for a while,
Yeah.
because we did have from the Harbin Institute 1 year seniors coming from Beijing,
Yeah.
and then
Is
others.
No,
that
they're-
still
they're-
going?
They're from her.
The Harbin, no, we don't have, we still have our connections. As you know, Andover is very well connected, and they utilize
Yeah.
the connections, and we still, I think, are in touch with the Harbin Institute, but
Yeah.
there's not an exchange program like we
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
back in the days.
Okay.
So how was the international community when you were here? It was smaller, maybe?
Good.
I think it changed during the time that we were here. We came in 1981, and certainly my memory was that the Kemper scholars were, the European students were what I think people thought of as international students at that time. The China, the opening to China had started the year before. You might have heard of Josh Miner, who was the director of admissions, and he was very instrumental in that. And there was an alumnus, I can't remember his name, but they were very interested in China. But and then let's see. People, there were some children, students who came because their father in most cases had gone here, and they had been raised abroad, because their father was in the foreign service, or was the ambassador to whatever. I don't remember all the different details, or was a business person in Argentina, and so they came. So whether they're considered international students or not, in different than the Kemper, but there were some connections that way. But we, when Don had a sabbatical in 1989, and the trustees said, we don't care what you do, just come back, and you can go lie on a beach in California or go do whatever you want. And we talked about it at length and decided that we wanted to go visit the places from which the international students were coming to Andover to sort of understand these communities. So we left in January of 1989, and we visited alumni and others in many different places, including we started in England, and then we visited SYA and was then in Rennes, France, and then we visited SYA in Barcelona, Spain. That's where they were, and we ended up purposefully a month or so later in Novosibirsk, because in 1985. will you tell about the PepsiCo connection and how that all started?
We asked parents to donate to the school, and so
That hasn't changed, I assume.
it's still going. And so we had written to all the parents, and one of the parents was the CEO of PepsiCo.
Don Kendall.
Don Kendall. And he had met Khrushchev at a trade fair in Europe, and he had convinced Khrushchev to give him a monopoly and not allow Coke into the Soviet Union. And so he developed very strong relations with the leaders of the Soviet Union. And his son, he was one of the parents we wrote to and said, would you support the school? And he said his son was a lacrosse player. And one day at a lacrosse game, I saw him and said hi. And he said, we got your letter and we'll be happy to support the school, but we want to do something relating to the Russian program. And I'll never forget, I went to see him and he said, the United States needs to understand the Soviet Union. He said I was just at a conference in Texas, and Richard Pipes, the Harvard professor, described it as the evil empire, and he got a standing ovation. And he said the next night I was the featured speaker, and I said they're different, the political systems are different, but we have to do business and we have to get along. And I got a standing ovation, and he said you can't have it both ways. He said, I'm concerned that people don't know about it, and my idea would be to support Andover faculty, and not just the Russian history and the Russian language teachers, but coaches and English teachers and so on to go to the Soviet Union. So we planned, and this is when the Soviet Union is just beginning to change. Gorbachev.
1985.
85. So Gorbachev was just making some changes. So we came up with a plan, and we said the plan would be that we would offer this trip to Andover faculty and their spouses, and that it would be 2 weeks of study on campus, both Russian language and Russian history and culture, and then it would be 2 weeks of travel visiting schools in the Soviet Union. And so we planned this for a group of 30 faculty to go, and we said that I think it was $500 a person. So for $500, you got this whole trip. So we offered it.
He subsidized the rest.
And he subsidized the rest. And so we offered this trip to the Andover faculty. And 90 people signed up. And I called him up and said, we've got a big problem here. How are we going to choose which 30 get to go? And he said, take them all and I'll give another gift next year and we'll cover the cost of this. And so in the summer of 1985, 90 members of the faculty and their spouses studied for 2 weeks together here and then traveled for 2 weeks in the Soviet Union. And it was just a remarkable experience, both to connect with the Soviet Union, but also to sort of have Andover faculty think about international perspectives and have a little better understanding of where Kemper scholars came from and, what it felt like to be an international student here. And so we traveled for 2 weeks and visited, and he helped us. He had good contacts, and we got to meet with various people. So it was just a fascinating experience, and it really, I think, helped the Andover faculty to be more open to international studies, international students, international experiences, the importance of travel, and so on.
And then it was during President Reagan's administration, and Jack Richards, who was a history teacher here and dean of the faculty, got involved with this idea of, well, tell them about
Oh, well, what happened was when we visited the embassy on this trip with the faculty, they said that they were negotiating
The U.S. Embassy.
we were at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and they said that there was going to be a summit meeting of Reagan and Gorbachev, and that was the first summit meeting. And they said they thought that probably the only thing they could get agreement on was a cultural and educational exchange.
They were just miles apart on all the other things, but that was pretty safe.
And so the U.S. Embassy was preparing the text for this, and they shared it with us, and we talked about it. And we wanted to propose an exchange of high school students, and
Because Andover had a really good Russian language program, and we felt
it would be a good
it was a
connection.
good connection.
And so we said, in the agreement where in the summit agreement, they were going to agree to exchanges for colleges and universities. And we said, could you add schools into that agreement so that secondary schools could propose exchanges? And they said, yeah, I think we can do that.
They lobbied for a while, but
Yes.
yes,
So
Andover did.
they added this to the agreement, and sure enough, when they met in Geneva in the first summit, they agreed to this cultural exchange. And so right away we proposed that we wanted to exchange students with a high school in the Soviet Union. And at that point, the Soviets had not allowed high school students to go and live with families and so on. They didn't think they were sort of ideologically prepared.
They didn't say that. But
They didn't say that, but that was the implication. We can't trust high school students to do this. So we proposed it, and we said we wanted to exchange students for a semester, and we would send 7 students there, and they would send 7 students here. And we submitted it to the U.S. State Department, and they gave it to the Soviet Education Department. And one day we got a phone call, and they said, their representatives are here, and they say they want to agree to that exchange that you proposed.
Wow.
And so Jack Richards and I, the Dean of Faculty and Russian history teacher, and I went down to Washington, and the U.S. State Department people said, we can't believe it, but they say they're going to sign it, and it'll be the first high school exchange where students have lived in the other institution. So we're in there, we're talking, and I said, this was exchange, it was exchange for a semester, and I'll never forget their negotiator said, well, the only thing is they can only come for 3 weeks. And I said, well, you don't understand quite how our system works. It's a semester. And I said, if you're going to study physics, you start in September and you finish by December, and we need your students to be there for the whole thing. And I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, the study of physics takes a lifetime. He said, 3 weeks, 10 weeks, doesn't matter. And right then I said, I'm going to agree to this. And I said, you're right. We're going to start with 3 weeks, and we're going to be pressing to move it to 10.
Wow.
And sure enough, they agreed to it. And the next thing we heard.
Well, it was really exciting because we were in a faculty meeting, and I forget whether it was Jack or somebody else came in and said, we've got the name of the school that we're going to exchange with, and everybody was like, and they said it was the Physics Mathematics High School in Novosibirsk. Everybody went, where? Who? I mean, it was, it wasn't someplace that was immediately on the tip of every American's tongue when you came to Russia, and but it was really exciting. And then I guess you went in,
Right. And what it was this is a school in Siberia, and it draws students who are talented in math and science from villages where they don't have, advanced calculus and so on. And so this was a chance for them to go to this school for 2 years because they were gifted in math and science. and then go to the university there, which is probably the #3 university after Moscow and St. Petersburg. And
It's located in Akademgordok, which is literally translates university town. And when, is it Khrushchev?
Khrushchev.
Yeah, when Khrushchev was trying to move the Academy of Science, he said, you know, look at, we have all this big land in Siberia, and that's where a lot of our potential and resources are. So he said to the Academy of Sciences, I'll build research facilities out, you know, it's like, you know, what everybody thinks of Siberia, out there. So they built, I think, 17 academic research institutes in different fields. And then they built housing, obviously, because it was near Novosibirsk. Novosibirsk is where the Ob River crosses the Trans-Siberian Railroad, if you think about it. Sort of goes like that. So it was a fairly industrial, I'm from Pittsburgh, so when I saw it, it reminded me of Pittsburgh. But this Akademgordok is far out from there, but that was, they built it. And it was also interesting because Khrushchev said he didn't want the buildings to be any taller than the pine trees that were there, which if you've been to at least then in the Soviet Union, everything with these monolithic concrete high-rise things. So it was really
special
cool.
For the science.
And he put they started a university, brought all the professors for that who were also in these 17 research institutes, and they added this physics mathematics high school. And there are others. There's one in Moscow, there's one in Leningrad. There are like 4, I think, or 5 nationwide now. There were then. I haven't kept up with it. But this one drew, drew from Siberia. And as Don said, it drew children that were in these small towns. And many of them, not many, but some of them were from what's now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Those Eastern Eastern Soviet.
What was the name of the school?
FEMA Physics Mathematics High School. Yeah, physics
Novosibirsk.
In Novosibirsk. Well, it's in Akademgordok, but Novosibirsk. And they sent you there. They asked you to come visit or something.
I went to see the school
before the kids came.
In 1985, and we were paired together with those. And
87.
then in 87 it started, and the exchange, and they came.
Well, you went to see the school first.
I went to see the school, yeah, and met the headmaster and so on, and we agreed that they were going to send 7 students, and they'd be here for 3 weeks in the fall, and everything. And then they sent a delegation here to visit, and I'll never forget William Thomas, the the music instructor, had the orchestra play the Soviet national anthem. Wow. And they marched into the chapel behind the American and the Soviet flag, and it was
a very historic
moment. It was a big deal, an historic moment.
And how did the trustees feel about that?
They were very supportive of it. I mean, they saw that the world was changing, and that probably the relationship between Soviet Union and U.S. were changing, and it was really a chance for Andover to be in the middle of that change in a way. And the first 7 students came, and they sent 2 teachers with them, and they were here, and one of the women students played the dobra, which was a traditional stringed instrument, and she played at school meeting.
They did a lot.
They did lots of things, and
but everything was so. I know I have to say this probably. I don't not only because we were there shortly thereafter. I mean, the contrasts in life in the Soviet Union at that time and life here, just in material things and all of that. And, you know, can you imagine just being plunked from one into the other? And it worked both ways. With the Andover students, it went the other way. But and it was just like, you know, things like they couldn't get over the fact that we had bananas at breakfast every day. You know, this was something they never got. I mean, it's such a small thing, or that they could walk down to, what was it, CVS or whatever, and, you know, there were all these things.
What an opportunity for dialogue and
yes,
learning.
and it was, and there were some really, you know, and just like you two are different, and, you know, every student that was there had their own personalities, their own views, their, you know, and it was, but just, and some of them were, they were all very good in math and science. We didn't say earlier that we asked once how they got there, and they take an exam, and I think it's over, at least then, a million students in the then Soviet Union took this exam, and they winnowed it down, and then they were interviewed for 2 or 3 days. They had to compete regionally and stuff, and then they got, I mean,
so
to
it's
this
like
school.
they chose 200 out of the million to go to this school.
Yeah. And some of them were in classes here in which they knew the science part, but, you know, again, it's studying in another language. We have a different approach in mathematics than they do. I don't know whether maybe it's true in your countries as well. So there was a lot, but there were much discussion.
What about English? How was the English language?
Again, it depended on the students. We had a English class for them, and basically an ESOL class.
And they had all studied English for a number of years, but they had never thought they'd get to use it. And it just, you know, that wasn't in their world to think that they could ever travel to an English-speaking country. And all of a sudden, here it was. They were here. And so you know, they weren't, it wasn't an immersion kind of experience on their part. And so being plunked into Andover was a wonderful chance for them to improve their English, but they did remarkably.
And then we did 2 or more, so then I think Vixtech maybe took the first, I can't remember, took the first group of Andover students to Femishaw, and then we went back, and then the number of weeks extended. I mean,
once the school people got involved, and it wasn't the bureaucrats in Moscow, they said, well, of course we want to stay the whole semester, you know, how can we make this work, kind of thing.
So when our sabbatical year, they sent different faculty members from Andover, and Don said, well, we'll take the group that's going, because we'll meet you when we get to there. So we were only the second Americans who lived in this community, or at that time. Yep, and we had a little apartment, and our daughters were in 6th and 9th grade, and we said we wanted to put them in PS1, the school. They had us look at a couple of schools for them, and one of them was I don't know what you would call it,
English language.
It was called the English school, and they thought surely that's where they wanted to go. And, you know, trying to be good parents, we said, you know, well, you know, let's see what Heather and Galen say. And Heather had taken Russian. She was at Andover High School, but she had started to take Russian here, which you could do then. I don't know whether that's still true, but, you know, there could be an exchange. And so she was doing that. Galen was only in 6th grade, and they looked at both schools, but and they said they wanted to go to the ordinary school. And I'll never forget going in with them and seeing the look on the face of the principal, who had never had a child in her school that wasn't from there. And, you know, and finally she had these 2 American kids, and, you know, they didn't really have enough Russian to negotiate, but it was an excellent experience for them, and it also gave us an entry into the community.
How brave of you,
Yeah,
trying that out. And that
Yeah.
was a semester for your daughters?
No, they were there the same time we were, from February until late May. So it was for them part of it. And then while we were there, Gary Lee, who's an Andover graduate who was a reporter from the Washington Post, came to visit the school, and he's a fluent Russian speaker, which he had learned at Andover. He's also African American. Wow. And it was an amazing experience because here were all these Soviet high school kids. Many of them had not encountered an African American, and when he opened his mouth and could, it's communicating, it was just, I think of things that I can see the day, and there are very few things that but I can see the day and see the reaction of, the students, and it was an amazing time to watch. And so we did that, and then we got on the Trans-Siberian Railroad and went across and went to Beijing, and then went north to Harbin and spent some time. And again, we got to see people from the university and talk about the exchange, because at that point they were sending 3.
Yeah, they sent 3 students.
But they were university. They had just finished their first year. I'm sure Nancy maybe talked about this in her remarks.
Yeah, well, it was well, first of all, it was in May and June of 1989, and Tiananmen Square happened on June 3rd, 1989.
We were in Beijing.
And so we were, when we got to Harbin, they had...
Which is very far north. Very far north.
The students were on strike, but there were still, things were normal, there was a lot of political debate and so on.
We got to meet some parents of
students that had come here.
And some students.
And some students,
Yeah.
yeah.
University.
And we met with the university people. And the challenge...
I was going to say they sent, I don't know whether this came up, but there was, the Harbin sent a teacher, Xiaomin, me, and so she, by that point, was back at Harbin. She had been here. She was really beloved when she was a teacher here. She was in the dorm, and she was just great.
Person.
Yeah, and she was very good. And so we saw, she was back in Harbin, so we got to see her. And then they asked her to travel with us in China, so that, because we didn't have the language facility at all, and that was a wonderful experience. But tell what
Well, what had happened was Andover had an exchange with China long ago, in the 20s and 30s. And when Nixon did the opening to China, he said, we had always considered them the enemy and the communists, and we had to contain them and so on. And then Nixon, when he was president with Henry Kissinger, went to China and said, we want to do business. And it was an opening, and the first representative that they named to go to China was George H.W. Bush, the father, the first President Bush. And he was an Andover trustee at the time, and this Josh Miner, the dean of admissions, said, George, I want you to get us some Chinese students here at Andover. That's the mission we're sending you on. And he tried, but it didn't quite work. And then this other Andover alumnus went to Harbin, which is way up in the north, distant from Beijing. And he proposed to the university there that they send students here. And their plan was to send the students here and do it as a direct exchange, so it didn't go through the central government in Beijing.
It's very smart.
And that they would send their best students who could speak English, and we were to help them get into college, and they wanted them to get college and graduate degrees. And their thought was they would then come back and be faculty members at Harbin, who would be trained in MIT and Caltech and different places. And so they sent these students, and they were excellent students, and we were able to help them get into college and to get scholarships, and many of them got graduate fellowships and went on to earn their PhD.
How long were they at Andover? For a year?
1 year.
1 year.
Yeah.
It's
So
sort of,
these
I
are-
always used to think of it as like a
Maybe
PG
they
year,
are the ones.
but going the other way. I mean, they had
Yeah.
completed a year at Harbin, so that gave them probably more English than if they had come right out of high school. And so then coming here, you'd think, well, that's sort of odd. You've had a year of college, now you're going back to high school for a year. But it was really to get them situated, really being able to use the language well and enough so that they could get into U.S.
Right, and culturally
colleges or
adjusted.
universities. And they were all very bright to begin with because they were at Harbin.
And
So-
did they go back to Harbin or did they stay in the United States?
That's an interesting question.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
So I went to negotiate the continuation of this arrangement.
In 1989.
In 1989, sending 3 students each year. And they had sent 3 students each year for 9 years. And so 27 of their best students had come here, and none of them had gone back. And
So we were really nervous.
I was dreading this meeting with the chancellor, what's he gonna, of course he's gonna end it because they're losing their good students,
Of course.
And so I put the best face I could on this, and so on. And I'll never forget, he just looked right at me and he said, I know they have not come back. And he said, I know why. He said, the laboratories at MIT are better than the laboratories here, and it's certainly understandable that they want to stay and work in those environments. But he said, they're Chinese, and they're from Harbin, and they will help us in other ways. And they will always be Chinese and always be from Harbin, and they will help us. And he said, we'd like to continue the exchange. And so I thought that was remarkable. And sure enough, it made me feel better when I heard that there was a trade delegation looking at opening businesses in the province where Harbin is located. And when they arrived, their consultant that they had hired in Hong Kong to advise them on this business strategy was one of the 27 students who had come to Andover and had studied at U.S. colleges and now was a consultant in Hong Kong and was helping U.S. businesses go into the province where the Harbin University is.
And you asked when we'd come back last, when we said we'd been here for Becky Sykes for the Wellness Center, and one of them was there because he is he has something really big in the alumni of Andover Alumni Association, and his son
Is here?
was there.
Was here.
Yeah. So
When was his son here? So I may remember.
A couple years ago.
couple years ago, so whenever.
Do you remember?
I don't remember
Yeah,
his
that's they come through, but
Yeah.
it's always interesting to see, who comes here. We are connected, and
Yes.
surely more
Yeah.
will come from the same families
Yes.
or
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
connections they have
Yeah.
built there.
So we left Harbin, got back on the train, and headed to Beijing because we hadn't seen any of, the sights and all of that. And there were some other school people that we wanted to see in Beijing. And by then things were really there was much more agitation, and I can remember we went to look at the Great Wall of China, and we went out in the morning and came back late in the evening and these tour kind of things. And literally the Statue of Democracy was like 2/3 of the way built. And then, because we were very close where we were staying to Tiananmen Square, and we were invited to one of the Harbin students' parent lived in Beijing, and we had been invited there, and she said, you know, well, we're getting this kind of news, and it was a very intense time. And we got up the morning of June 3rd and took with Xiaomin, me, this teacher, and we were going to go to Chongqing to go down the Yangtze River. And when we we landed in Chongqing, and we went to the hotel, and we went to walk in the market, and Xiaomin said, I don't like what I'm hearing. We need to go back. And so we went back to the hotel, and she had heard what had happened in Tiananmen Square. And, you know, we had seen students going back into the square as we left, but it had occurred just after we had passed by. So then they were very anxious to get us out of there. So we had this riverboat we were supposed to go on, and she said, well, we were supposed to leave at like 7 in the morning to get there. And she came and got us at like 4:30, and she said, we need to leave now. So we got in a taxi and went to get on the riverboat. And we only learned that morning that at about 6 o'clock in the morning, the students, Chongqing is like Pittsburgh. It's a confluence of rivers and bridges. And the students got on the bridges, and they stopped the traffic and systematically let the air out of all the tires. So they ground this huge city to a halt without a bullet, without anything, in protest for what had happened in Tiananmen Square. It was really powerful. And I mean, you know, when you think about how nonviolent activities can work, but that's what they did. They let the air out the tires, and you know, there was no ability to move in this city. And so we waited on this boat, and it was supposed to take
125 staff and 125 international tourists. And because they declared martial law and people hadn't come, there were 125 staff and 25 passengers. And so for the next...
And we had a shortwave radio that we had taken on, because we were, you know, in so many different places on this trip, and we were really popular. So we would stand on the deck of the ship at night and hold it up because you could get BBC, and all the crew of this, the Chinese crew, wanted to hear what was, you know, happening, because they didn't have the news.
The Chinese press wasn't saying anything.
Yeah, the news. Yeah, so it was quite a... And
so
then when we got
we were never in any physical danger, but it was just the uncertainty. You didn't know what might happen, and we were very fortunate.
And we got
you
to
were
the
family
end.
too.
Yes,
2 daughters.
Yes, they were with us. Yeah. And we got to the end, and then they said they thought we were supposed to do something else, and our next stop after that was Hong Kong, and the U.S. government said, leave. They were evacuating all foreigners. You know, we were Canadians and everything. So we flew to Hong Kong, where there were Andover alumni.
Welcomed us. It was nice to...
And it was amazing as we came into Hong Kong under this overpass. There was a sign that said, it said it in English as well as Chinese. I wouldn't have known what it said. It said, "Facts save lives." And I know the fax machine was just becoming a thing. I mean, now it's, it's passé, but it was just becoming, and we asked our hosts about it, and they said what happened were people from Hong Kong got the telephone numbers of places in China, and universities and business, and any numbers that they could, and they just started sending faxes about what was happening, and then people would just throw the information out the way. It was such a,
they said they would
credible.
fax from Hong Kong to China, and then when it came through, the people in China would put it on the Xerox machine and make 100 copies, and they just opened the office window and throw these 100 copies out, and people were picking up the news from the lawn that had been printed that morning in Hong Kong.
How did this experience transform you when you came back to Andover, and what did you make out of it?
Well, one of the other things we went, because we were systematically going around, we went to Japan from China, and we did a lot of research before we left to see who we should be seeing, and of course development people had alumni and things, but it turns out that there's the founder of Doshisha University went to Andover and Nishima-jo, and so we wanted to go to Doshisha and pay our respects, and we asked to see where he was buried, and they said nobody had ever asked, they didn't have a connection, and he's so revered in that country. And he was you probably know the story of him.
Oh, he smuggled himself on the boat? Is
yes,
that the
yes,
story?
and there was an Andover graduate who...
Can you elaborate a little bit, because we only hear a little bit of what you remember about the story?
Well, what I remember about the story was he...
Japan was closed.
It was 18... Yeah.
In the 1800s, it was closed. They weren't allowing a Western influence to come in. And so in the midst of this young boy, 13 or something, smuggled himself onto a ship going to the United States. And that was...
It ended in Boston, and the ship's captain sort of said, what are we going to do with him? And I think it was the owner?
The owner
of the ship was an Andover graduate.
Yeah.
And he said, well, let's see if we can,
Send
what
him
in
to
Andover. I can imagine. I can imagine. And it was a time of great religious fervor in the United States, and he became part of that. And
he went to Andover, and then he went to Amherst College for college, and then he came back to Andover Theological Seminary. At one point, Andover was a school for boys and a religious school, a theology school. And he came back and went to the theology school. And the story is that he went to a conference of the church in Rutland, Vermont, and he stood up and said, the Lord has called me to go back to Japan and found a Christian university in Japan, and I won't leave until I have $5,000. And sure enough, they raised the $5,000, and he went back. And of course, Japan is just opening up a little bit, and he founded Doshisha University, which was a Christian university, and was based on what he had learned here about philosophy.
So we got to meet people from the university.
We met the chancellor, and we visited Nishima-jo's gravesite, and
we also visited with Andover alumni.
Visited with Andover alumni, and Doshisha is a big university, and it has a high school associated with it, and so we went to visit the high school and talk to them about building some links to it.
And I think I can't quite remember the timing, but we were talking here about the Japanese languages. possibly was that.
Yeah. And they were very fascinated with Andover and the connection. And two things that I remember that sort of came out of it were they wanted to send an alumni group here to visit where he lived and everything about it. And they had a choir that was going to come and sing, and they took over Symphony Hall in Boston for the Doshisha alumni event and everything.
Very big.
And William Thomas and the orchestra played with them, kind of thing. It was a big deal, and they were just
It was very special.
It was very special, good. And then we proposed that we exchange gifts, and we were going to send them something that was very Andover, and they were going to send us something that was very Doshisha. And so we had a replica of the weather vane that's on San Phil made, and we presented that to them. It was a gigantic challenge to get it there, but we got it there and presented it to them. And they gave us a granite replica of the pillar that stands at the entrance to their university with the words of the founder on it. Nijimajo. And it's up by Bullfinch, and it's the pillar that's right in front of the wellness center there. And it was a gift from Doshisha University to Phillips Academy. So it was just sort of nice to make that connection and share that.
And did they send students from the high school?
I don't think we
I know
ever
about the
got-
toy exchange, but that's something else.
No, we talked about exchanging students, but we never, that never happened while we were here.
And we went to visit Tony, but we didn't.
Yeah.
And were the international students integrated with the Americans? Do you think they connected?
I can only speak for myself. I don't answer, but I think both of us, when we came back from that
The more
experience,
travel and visits.
all the travel and visiting and so forth, we thought a lot about how we had been received and how much we had learned, and and we began to try and do some things that we thought would. I'm not saying that international students, I think, were well received here, but I'm not sure that. Anyway, we tried to do some things that, because it had made a big
Impression on us.
Do you remember any changes that you tried to make after this? Because I'm sure when you left.
Well, I think the international student coordinator was one of the things that sort of came out of that.
So there wasn't any international student coordinator before. And who was the first? Was that Hal McCann?
Yes.
I've heard your name, Britta, though. So
Yes.
I think maybe you were the first. Your name has fallen.
Yeah.
But there were faculty that were, like Hal and Becky McCann and the Wilkins and the Specks and Sue Lloyd, and the people were connected to various programs that they had experienced either as an exchange faculty or they had those students in their classes. Carol and Elaine Bailey, who were the epitome of hospitality, and Carol taught the English class to many international students, and they made their dorm and home open to international students and made sure that. So there were lots of folks, and I think when I was asked to do this, we were trying to help with host families for international students, which we tried to increase the numbers and the connections with those, because I think originally just the Kemper scholars maybe had host families, but we tried to give those opportunities to others Andover students who
And
wanted.
that was in the early 90s?
Yes.
That's my recollection,
Yes, it
like
was.
92 or so.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Because I see that every year, every
It's
year it's
hard.
one more.
Yeah.
And share that with the host families, which they have developed. We have had as many as 125 students signed up in the program in recent years.
And we try to have various gatherings of them, the flags that are carried. We want to talk. We were talking in the car on the way up about